The Firewall Sorceress is a build that has had its ups and downs, and with the fixed overlapping firewalls released last year, a lot of people were upset and quickly spoke of doom and gloom, at least for this build. But the reality is, Firewall has been an extremely competent secondary element skill for ages, and with the right setup these days, can be equally as competent as a primary skill. So today we're going to look at the Firewall build I run whenever I get the itch, and that is Firewall Orb. One of the advantages of this build is that it is functional even without Sunder Charms, much like the Hydra Orb build itself, but this particular beast is a bit better at crowd control, while the Hydra Orb Sorceress kind of more specializes in massing up more single target damage. Now, the main challenge you'll have while getting used to the Firewall Sorceress is going to be learning to aim it, since with controller it will involve dropping a firewall and then running the length of said firewall, while with mouse and keyboard you will be manually aiming at the ground away from most enemies outside of act bosses, and with Resurrected's assisted aim effect, this can be a little annoying at times, since it will auto-snap to enemies if you aim too close to them. But once you get it down, it runs just as well as pretty much every other dual elemental setup for clearing the game, so you can get started on those terror zones and other endgame runs to build up your gear. Starting with the skills as usual, we obviously have Firewall, since it is the namesake of the build, and being only a level 18 required skill, it is not terribly hard to get running well before the end of normal. Though, unfortunately, you won't be using any of its synergies as active skills until then, so it's a little bit of a mixed bag. The other big skill you can pick out from the name is Frozen Orb, which is sort of a personal preference, and while if you have a Sundered Charm you can get away with skipping it and going for, say, a defensive skill, or even just another fire skill, I personally prefer using Orb regardless, as it provides a nice consistent area of effect damage for super cheap, even when we are not pumping it. That said, one common alternative is to go the energy shield route, or more precisely the telekinesis route with a low-level energy shield. I personally do not like this one very much, as I prefer to go full tilt into energy shield when I use it, including its supporting stats, since going low energy shield will often result in the urge to split stats in some setups, and in others I could just use those skill points to kill faster in the first place, and with Firewall Orb you can easily juggle your two skills to do just that. Outside of your core skills though, it's pretty much just your one-point wonders like Static Field for chunking boss health down at higher player counts, and in the early leveling process of course, and of course Teleport for mobility, as well as your synergies and masteries, with Orb only getting 1 point in Cold Mastery and no extra points in synergies, since pretty much all your points are going to go into Firewall and its synergies so that it will deal reasonable damage. In terms of the Firewall synergies, Warmth is much higher priority than Inferno due to, of course, the higher percent boost, as well as just overall greater utility for using the skill. And of course, you want as much Mastery as possible, though do remember, Mastery as well as plus percent damage from gear is applied after synergies, giving them a multiplying effect for this kind of stuff. So even small boosts from synergies will generally have a much bigger boost than listed overall for fire and lightning skills. As far as leveling, your first 17 levels will be, well, slow. You'll be picking up your 1-point wonders as well as your prerequisites, but you will lack a lot of kill skills. And no, I would not waste points dumping into Inferno while doing this personally, since you will appreciate the warmth points much more whenever you finally hit level 18 and can start casting your primary skill. Though, if you absolutely need it, Inferno won't hurt your skill progression too much, outside of maybe needing to rush to an Insight Polearm in Nightmare, whereas if you go Warmth, you generally don't have to push hard for it. As far as the order of getting skills, you will want to reserve a few for level 30, but up until then, investing straight into Firewall itself will be fine. Saving so you'll have like 3 points at level 30 or so, 1 for Fire Mastery, 1 for Orb, and 1 for Cold Mastery, and generally to make Nightmare easier from level 30 onward, you will be just putting your points into Orb itself from there on out, since it will greatly smooth the Nightmare experience and give you plenty of support damage for working your way through hell whenever you do run into fire immunes. Now, any spare points you have from quests, or after reaching max level with Orb itself, will go into Firewall, with the skill itself being the first priority, and then Warmth and Fire Mastery being the next, with Inferno being the last thing you level, and if you need to cut points, that would be where to lose them from, since some people prefer doing the Ice Bolt synergy for Orb instead of just the pure fire we're doing here, just a bump to make sure they do damage more evenly split between the elements. In terms of gear along the way, it is your standard caster gear. In normal, you want things like stealth for armor, which is pretty easy to get with Taloneth. And since we're a fire-focused build, Leaf is also a fairly nice early staff to get. And yes, you actually can get a +3 Firewall staff from Drognin in Act 2 normal and slap a Tyr and a Rawl in it and get a little bit of extra damage. Though I would not waste too much time farming for that, since we'll be replacing it in Nightmare. That's because in Nightmare you can start setting up your Spirit Sword, whether it's in a Crystal Sword from Cows or a Broadsword from Nightmare. This just helps us out quite a bit more than Leaf, since it also frees up your shield for creating things like Rhyme, Ancient's Pledge, or even just a perfect diamond shield. As far as Mercenary through all of this, an Act 1 or Act 2 Mercenary with Insight is usually my go-to early on, with a preference towards Act 2 since he will tank and hold enemies in place a bit better, making learning to use your firewalls just a little bit easier. Now, Holy Freeze or Prayer is going to be your optimal choice when you're using Insight, while Holy Freeze tends to win out whenever you finally switch over to endgame weapons like Infinity. Speaking of endgame though, there are some items like lucky rolls on diadems or spectacular rares that can be sought after for this build, but for the most part, normal Sorceress chase gear for fire builds is pretty much a set of consistent rune words and uniques, so it does help out item hunting a bit. Starting in the weapon, we have probably the easiest pick of the bunch, and that is Ashuta's Temper, with fire skills, faster cast, and natural boost to fire damage, and the ability to be socketed because it's a unique. You'd be hard-pressed to beat it, and while there are fun rune words you can use for bigger minus resists, this is just super consistent and does still help us with Orb thanks to the plus all Sorceress skills, which lets us keep that more relevant in the endgame version of the build. Our helmet, however, is 100% for our firewall, and that is Flickering Flame, since in endgame you will likely be using a Fire Sunder charm. This is hard to pass up since the Fire Resist aura helps just counteract it, while also providing us with plus fire skills, reduced enemy fire resist, and a few other fairly nice minor perks. For the amulet, I just went with Mara's, though a good caster amulet would be solid here as well. I just wanted resists and I'm not terribly concerned about faster cast, since short of teleporting, this build is not super reliant on it for PvE. Not to mention, this is a lot easier to come by than a 220 caster amulet for the Sorceress. In the shield slot, we have Phoenix. You could run Spirit here for the Orb, but Phoenix serves many useful roles for a fire build. That is just generally hard to argue with. Thanks to minus fire resist, some nice life and resist perks, and a super useful redemption aura that basically means every battle turns into a full rejuvenation potion, meaning your mana and life stays topped off quite easily. There's a reason this is still one of my favorite rune words, despite the fact that I play Necro Summoners a lot. Now, down in the boots, since we're going low magic find to find item bases, I went with Waterwalks, though any of the endgame boots would work just fine, with War Travelers being the magic find option, or even stuff like Alder's boots being solid picks as well. That said, I will sometimes grab Inferno Stride just for more, well, fire, though we don't really get much from that we wouldn't get from just casting it ourselves. Now, the rings and belt are fairly predictable. Dual Stones of Jordan and Arachnid's Mesh for plus skills and mana on both of the above. A little bit of faster cast on the belt doesn't hurt either. You could swap out the stones for faster cast and resist rings if absolutely needed, but again, we have 2 delay skills as our main spells, so it's not super important. And it should be said, the gloves are probably pretty obvious as well, with Mage Fist pretty much being the go-to Sorceress gloves for 90% of PvE builds, with Trangs only really winning out for builds that don't rely on warmth for much. Chance Guards are also fairly decent here if you are going for Magic Find, but there is a limited return on that because, well, after a certain percent, you're wasting kill speed for more Magic Find. Now on the armor, I am going to piss some people off. I went with Chains of Honor. Resists and plus skills, it's a solid armor that I do like using, all for relatively cheap with the only pricey rune being the Bear rune. If you're going to go for more damage-oriented setups, you go with Ormus Robes with plus Firewall, though getting that to drop in single player is pretty rare since the robes can drop with any level 24 or lower Sorceress skill. That's a lot of options. And if you're going for Magic Find, you go with Enigma or your choice of Magic Find armor, though Enigma is only slightly lower than the alternatives in that regard and has way better bonuses. On the Mercenary, we have your standard Infinity Mercenary in the endgame, since even though Conviction won't break most cold immunes and only breaks about half of the fire immunes, if you have a Fire Sunder Charm, it does contribute a bonus 17% reduction in enemy fire resist on the sundered targets. And since he'll be tanking enemies, the increased hit chance he gets from it, as well as your faster kill time, will add up. And I just run the usual Fortitude and Vampire's Gaze to square him away. There are of course more offensive and more defensive setups, but this just hits that sweet spot I need for him. Charm-wise, plus fire skills, Sunder, and of course Torch and Annihilus, while using your small charms to fill any gaps in Resist, Magic Finder stats, and you're just squared away. Overall, I'd put the build at maybe a B or C in terms of what it takes to get used to it, but it can keep pace with much more popular and much more mainstream builds in terms of clear speed and functionality, with only hyper-focused builds with top-end gear really outpacing it at any of their kind of targeted goals. So, do you bother considering dual elemental sorceresses that can clear the entire game, or do you prefer playing single elemental and just teleporting past things to get your endgame content, like say the Blizzorb sorceress on screen now? Mention it down below, and as always, a special thanks to the regular viewers and patrons that keep this channel alive.